Everyone doing? Good. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Professor Barlow Demirgadician of the Armenian Studies program. Tonight we're going to be listening to a presentation by Dr. David Zakarian. But first I want to just tell you about some of our upcoming events. So we're at the middle of October already. It's kind of hard to believe that the month is going by so quickly. But our next event is going to be on Friday, November the 1st. Having a guest speaker from Germany. Her name is Dr. Ilke, let me just move it to the left.
Yeah, I'm just going to move it while I'm here.
Dr. Ilke Yilmaz, and she's going to speak, she's actually speaking all over the United States. So we've coordinated with UC Berkeley, University of Michigan, UCLA, and she's traveling all over the United States, and she's going to be talking about her on Ottoman passports and how the Ottoman passports in the pre-Republic period were used as actually a tool by the government to help control the minorities, including Armenians, Kurds, Greeks, and other people. So that'll be on Friday, November the 1st. Then on Friday, November the 8th, Dr. Simon Mekhitarist will be giving the third part series of lectures on the Armenian cultural heritage, and he'll be talking about the future. So he talked about the past, he talked about the present, what's happening in Turkey, and on Friday, November the 8th, he'll be talking about the future of the past, saving messages in Turkey. You remember that his last lecture, he was unable to make it. We did it by Zoom, but he will be in person for the third lecture, and he's a very excellent speaker, so we invite you to be there. And then finally, our really popular speakers who's coming back to Fresno is Zakarian, a photographer and an artist who has published several books. I left the German part underneath it, but he's not from Berlin. He's from Montreal, actually. And he'll be speaking on a new book on khachkars. Khachkars are the stone crosses. And he's going to make a connection between the khachkars and Armenian manuscript illumination. So he's going to talk about some of the connections in terms of the symbolism that's used in the lecture. So I invite all of you to join us for these. These are all free. They'll all be here in this same auditorium. And I'm now going to just switch over to our... So today I have the great pleasure to introduce, for the first time here at Fresno State, our guest speaker, Dr. David Zakarian. But he's not a guest any longer. He is the Haig and Isabel Berberian Endowed Chair of Armenian Studies at Fresno State. The chair in the Berberian chair was established in 1889 here at Fresno State. And Dr. Dikran Kuyumjan was the first holder of the chair. And when he retired in 2008, a worldwide search was conducted, and we had a new professor, Dr. Joe Laporta, who's here tonight. Dr. Laporta, would you raise your hand? He is now currently, yes, round of applause. He left his position as the Berberian chair to become the associate dean in the College of Armenians, and today is the interim dean in the Kremen School of Education. So when he left that position, that left it open again. We did another international search, and this time we chose Dr. David Zakarian. I want to tell you a little bit about him. He has a bachelor's degree and master's degree in English language and literature from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, that's in Greece, and a master's in classical Armenian and a DPhil in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford. His doctoral thesis was on really what he's going to be talking about tonight, which is the representation of women in early Christian literature, Armenian texts of the 5th century. From 2017 to 2019, he was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at Oxford, and he was researching Christian-Muslim interactions in Armenian poems. He later taught classical and modern Armenian at Oxford from 2020 to 2024, and he's the author of 2 monographs. One, Women Too Were Blessed, the Portrayal of Women in Early Christian Armenian Texts, and a co-editor of Armenia Through the Lens of Time, Multidisciplinary Studies in honor of Theo Martin van Lint. Theo Martin van Lint is the endowed professor at Oxford University, so it was done in honor of him. I believe he was one of your first mentors or teachers. So he's also published extensively on Armenian manuscripts and early Christian literature. Dr. Zakarian is now teaching 3 courses this semester. He's teaching our beginning Armenian language course and 2 sections of our masterpieces of Armenian literature. masterpieces of Armenian culture. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight Dr. David Zakarian. Dr. Zakarian.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's really exciting to be here and to give a talk about something that I care very much, and I have been working on this topic for many years. So as Professor Barlow mentioned, this was the topic of my dissertation, and I want to give you some background why I did this, and then I'll deal with more details. So the key point was to find out what was the position of women in society in Armenia, sources that can tell us about this. If you open up history books, it's all about men. It's all about political changes, what is happening in the countries, in the wars, and so on, all the battles and everything else. So my aim was to try and read all the classical texts from the 5th century onwards, because this is when we have the birth of Armenian literature as we know today, the so-called golden age of Armenian literature. And my methodology was to find every single passage in those texts that refer to women and try to find out what these men, all these texts were written by men, what these men are going to say of women, and how women fared in that society, what was their position, what they were doing then. And one of the reasons why I did this, I have often heard this expression, and I'm sure most of you have done the same, that whenever there was a justification of some sort of, let's say, hierarchical values in the Armenian communities, that was always referred to as a tradition. So that's our tradition, this is how we have always been doing. So I was trying to figure out, was this our tradition? Where does it come from? So I'll try to show you today my findings. So I didn't have any agenda when I started that work. I really wanted to understand what these texts are saying about women. Do they say that women are inferior to men? Is this something that the church was saying in the century, like, for example, the Greek sources were saying or the Syriac sources were saying? So you'll find out today what the Armenian sources of the 5th century were saying about women. So today's talk I'm divided into 3 parts. I'll speak about the Christianization narratives. 2 of them were written in the 5th century. There are other texts as well, but I will focus on these 2. Then I will speak about the canons of the Shahabivan Council that was held in Armenia in 444. And then I'll try to link it to today, to how this research into early Christian Armenian texts can help us understand what's going on in Armenian communities, in Armenian societies, and to try and revisit a little bit the position of women in society, try to understand it in a different way. And this is also the reason why I did the research, was that if we want to write history of any people, we could ignore at least 50% of the population, which are women. We can't just write about men, so we need to write about everyone in that society. And women usually didn't have voice. All these texts were written by men, primarily. So let's see what these men were saying about women. Many of you might be aware that the Christianization narratives come into Armenian literary works tradition. So we have the Syriac tradition, the story that is based on the Syriac tradition, and the Greek tradition. So the Syriac tradition is linked to the martyrdom of Saint Thaddeus, one of Christ's apostles. And we have this story that finishes, the Syriac tradition finishes in Urha, in Edessa. However, the Armenian tradition carries on with that story. So I'll give you more details later. And then we have a Greek tradition that tells about how Armenia became Christian, and that's the story most of you are familiar with. That's the story of Saint Gregory the Illuminator. So I'll briefly speak about the first text and in more details about the second text, because the second text that speaks about the Greek tradition is much more popular, I would say, and it's kind of considered to be the received tradition how Armenians became Christian. So the story begins with the narrative, the Armenian narrative, begins with Saint Thaddeus coming to the city of Edessa, where there is King Abdash, who is quite sick and he's dying. His doctors cannot do anything to help him. So through his faith, through his prayer, he manages to cure him. And as a result of that, King Abdash converts to Christianity. Now, the Syriac story finishes approximately there. The Armenians, however, continued the story, and they said, no, he didn't stay in Syria, he didn't die there. He moved on, and he came to Armenia. And in Armenia, at the time, according to the story, we have King Sanadruk. And King Sanadruk himself was a follower of Zoroastrian religion, the pre-Christian Armenian religion, and of course he was quite hostile towards Saint Thaddeus. However, his daughter, Sanducht, becomes one of the most devout believers in Christ, and she follows him throughout. So the story continues, lots of details. I'm not going to go into this, but there are some interesting things that I want you to pay attention to. So first of all, Sanducht starts, she's becoming a Christian, and she starts helping Saint Thaddeus. I think she could. She had the financial resources, so she supports in all his activities. This story is kind of built on the story of Thecla and Saint Paul. There is this, the Apocrypha that we have, and the Armenian text follows that Greek story, but in the Armenian context. So Sanducht supports with everything she could. She sustains the apostle. She preaches Christianity. And very interestingly, we have a lot of references to her converting Christians. A woman converting and a woman preaching is something that St. Paul, for example, disapproved a lot, because there is a passage in the Testament, to which we'll come later, where he says that women should be silent. They don't teach. They have no right to teach. But the Armenian tradition has this, a young lady, young virgin, who is teaching and preaching at the same time and converting. So eventually she is killed by her own father because she refuses to obey his rule, and eventually Saint Thaddeus himself is also martyred by the same King Sanadruk. So when Sanducht is martyred, according to the story, 2,000 people convert to Christianity. And then after that, when Saint Thaddeus is martyred, there is a specific number which is also very interesting. I don't know where it comes from, but 3,433 men and women convert to Christianity. So this is how the story ends. And this is the link of Armenian church to apostolic mission, because Saint Thaddeus was an apostle. We have another apostle who was in Armenia, and according to some Greek sources, he was buried in Armenia, Saint Bartholomew. So based on these two traditions that we have, the Armenian church is referred to as the Armenian Apostolic Church. So this is a connection of the Armenian church with the Christ's apostles. So this is one of the stories that we have. And as you could see here, there is a central figure here, which is the king's daughter, Sanducht, and she's really very active. And she does certain things that are not considered to be mainstream Christian at that period. Now, this text, we believe that it was written down in the 5th century, so we don't have the critical edition, so we can't say much more about this. But this was a story that was quite familiar for the Armenian audiences. Now, much more widespread, I would say, text is, of course, the Agatha Yelos's History of Armenia. So this is one of the most prominent Christians that was translated in several languages. It was translated into Greek, into Arabic, into Persian, into Syriac, into Latin, and so on. So this was a very popular text, because it tells us how Armenia became a Christian nation. And this is the story that the Armenian church promotes today in any means that they can. So, I'll give you the background. Most of you are familiar with this story, but for those of you who don't know, I'll start from the beginning. So the story starts in 224, when the Sasanian dynasty seizes power in Iran. So dethroning the Parthians. And you must know that the Armenian kings at the time were of Parthian origin. So there was this agreement between the Parthians and the Romans that the Armenian king would normally be the Arsacid Armenian king, the Arshaguni. The Armenian king was from the junior branch of the Persians. So when the revolution happens in Iran, usually there is a revolution in Iran for some reason and it affects everyone else. But when this revolution happens in Iran, it affects, of course, Armenia. So this happened in 220. Now the Armenian king, who belonged to the former family, decides to take a revenge, but he fails. So what we know is at the time the Armenian king was Khosrow. So he's assassinated by a certain Anak. Now Anak was the father of Saint Gregory. And so the king of Armenia at the time becomes Khosrow's son, King Tartar III, or the fourth, depending how we count this. So he decides to take revenge for his father's death, and he kills Anak and tries to exterminate his family. But Saint Gregory manages to escape to the land of the Greeks, to Caesarea. So he becomes a Christian there. He lives for a while there, and then he decides to come back to Armenia and to serve King Tartar, because he knew what his father, that he killed the king. So he's trying in that way somehow to expiate his sins. So he's in the service of the king, and one day the king says, okay, let's go and have fun in a temple of goddess Anahit, a Zoroastrian goddess, and you have to pray to goddess Anahit. And Gregory says, no, I'm Christian, I cannot do this. So the story goes on that Saint Gregory his identity is revealed to the king decides to punish him, and the king throws him in that deep pit. Or the Armenian word for this is Khorvida. And I think those of you who visited Armenia have been to this place. That's Mount Ararat, and this is where the monastery complex is. And somewhere over here, there is actually a deep pit in which you could go, and it's an interesting experience. It's a very steep downhill descent, and if you visit Armenia, I highly recommend you go there. It's claustrophobic, but it's interesting that it is linked to the place that we have this entire story. So you heard the first part of Agathangelos' history. So Tartar throws St. Gregory into the deep pit to punish him. And because that was full of snakes and scorpions, so the idea was that he would die there. So his sentence. Now, Agathangelos then takes us from Armenia to Rome. So the story continues in Rome with the Emperor Diocletian, who is seeking to find a beautiful wife. And he sends his envoys around his empire to find and paint a beautiful girl and then send him the picture. So it's a kind of ancient time Tinder or whatever it is. So that was the way they were doing. And they come to this monastery outside the Rome, and Mekhitarist, a beautiful nun living there. She is of royal origin as well. She's got some royal blood there. And the servants of the emperor decided, oh, she's really beautiful, let's paint her and send it to Diocletian. And Diocletian, of course, falls in love with her, decides to marry her, and as a result of that, Abbess Gayane and some other nuns from the monastery decide to flee. So from Rome, they travel to Armenia to escape the emperor's pursuits. When she arrives in Armenia, then the Armenian king falls in love with her, because she's so beautiful. But it's also interesting that the Armenian king was married at the time. He had a wife, so that was a Zoroastrian tradition. So that was prominent. You could have multiple wives. So now you can't escape anymore. So Tartar attempts to take her by force because she refuses it. There is a very beautiful description of an 8-hour fight between a very strong king who allegedly swam through Euphrates River with a horse on his shoulder. So very powerful guy, and this young lady. And there is the fight is really physical, but I think the way it is described, you can say that at some point Ripsime knocks off his crown, it falls down, and basically eventually, through the help of God, she defeats him. So this a little girl manages to defeat a very powerful soldier. She escapes. So in other words, it's a description of an attempted coup which didn't happen. So Ripsime escapes, but unfortunately the soldiers capture her and all her companions, and they are all killed in the capital of Armenia at the time, in Vagar-Shabad, which is known today as Echmiadzin. So because he did this, because he killed these saint women, according to Agapangelos, the king turns into a wild boar. And he, according to the text, he wallows naked in the reeds and so on. And the entire country of Armenia plunges into darkness. Of course, this is all a metaphor trying to show that how bad what he did was and how everyone was affected. So Agapangelos says he goes crazy. Now, what to do to save the king? Another woman appears there. So this woman is Khosrow-Viducht, sister of the king, and she sees a vision. So God comes and talks to her in a vision and says, the only way you could say the Armenians be saved is if we go and fetch Saint Gregory from the deep pit, who has been there for 13 years. So Khosrow-Viducht was a pious woman, that's why God spoke to her. So she goes and tells men, and of course dismiss her, because, and there is even this sentence saying, what do you know, woman, about these things? Then she sees the same thing 5 times. Every time she goes and tells these people, go and fetch Saint Gregory. He's the only person who can save us. So they go to the pit and they find Saint Gregory alive after 13 days. In the first slide, I kind of skipped that bit, but there is a line saying that when Saint Gregory was thrown into the deep pit, there was a widow from a neighboring village who would come and throw a loaf of bread every day into the pit, knowing that a saint person is in that pit. So Saint Gregory survives. He's brought back, he baptizes the Armenian king, he baptizes the nobility, and there is this description of how the king's wife, Ashkan, and also sister Khosrow-Viducht actively participate in helping the king in this process. First of all, it's linked to the burial of the virgins, and then it's also about, there is a reference about how the churches were built on the places of Zoroastrian temples. So Saint Gregory is sent to Caesarea because the Armenians didn't have a bishop. He is then ordained as a bishop of Armenia, and he comes back to Armenia and establishes the Armenian church. And there is also the reference to King Tatar visiting Constantinople at the time. And the story finishes with Saint Gregory's son Aristakes, who became Armenian. They didn't call him Catholico at the time, but it's like the Catholic of the Armenians. And he visits the very famous Council of Nicaea in 25, an ecumenical council in which the representatives of all the churches were present. That was the first ecumenical council, and the Armenian church was present there in 325. We have also this image from, so it was a mural in Echmiadzin Cathedral, and if I'm not mistaken, it's in the History Museum in Yerevan. So where you could see the king, the queen, Ashkan, and Khosrow-Viducht, so depicting this scene where Saint Gregory is basically preaching and converting, and they are always praying. Now, I want you to visually look at the structure of what I just told you about this story. So the first part was with Saint Gregory. The second part in red, it's all related to Ribsime. So it's in the middle of the story. And then we have the end of the story. So without, if we look just structurally at this, without this middle part, the story doesn't stand as itself. Of course, it has lots of legendary elements. That's not what I'm going to discuss today. The fact is that this was believed by people, this was perceived by people to be true. So, first of all, that part, that without the women, without Ribsime, so first of all, without this widow, who keeps him alive by throwing the loaf of bread, then the entire martyrdom of Ribsime. If this didn't happen, then Khosrow-Viducht wouldn't see this vision. She wouldn't go and tell that you need to go and fetch Saint Gregory from it, and Armenia wouldn't become Christian. So this is a very important part structurally of that text. Now I will go into details, just pointing out that some specifics in the text which are really very interesting, and unfortunately these are topics that are not discussed enough. So this is from the first part, from the prologue of Agathangelos' history. So when he speaks about what is his story going to be about, he mentions that an order came to me. He identifies himself as the secretary of King Tartat, to compose a narrative about God's beloved martyrs, how and why they came, who arose like luminaries to scatter the mist of darkness from the land of Armenia. So this story is not so much about Saint Gregory, or only about Saint Gregory. It's also about these women. And the word that, the Armenian word lusavork, the luminous, was also the word that was used for apostles of Christ and Christ himself. And usually these words were chosen very specifically to provide specific meaning. It's not like a random choice of words. So it is important that the author of this text refers to Hypsime and her companions as luminaries, who came to scatter the mist of darkness in the land of Armenia. Another very interesting reference to it is that in the text that we find, that Saint Gregory himself in the text refers to Hypsime and her companions, saying these were apostles of yours, and then compares Hypsime to Saint Paul. So this elevates Hypsime and her companions to a completely different level. So they are much, much higher than it is presented today in the church or in the books, and I'll speak about this later. So this is from the original text itself. I want you to keep this in mind. Another thing that is very important that I found interesting while reading this text is the reference to the Virgin Mary. Now, in the early Christianity, Eve was blamed for everything that happened to humanity. And by extension, all women were to blame because of Eve. So we have this story in Greek church fathers. We find the same thing in Latin church fathers. But there were some others who believed that that's not actually accurate. We had about the Virgin Mary. So we have a Greek author, Irenaeus, for example, who said that no, women, yes, Eve was the first one to be deceived. But then we have the Virgin Mary who came and basically saved everyone, including women. So we shouldn't treat women badly. Based on Eve, women were considered to be, based on her creation, as you know in the Bible, she comes from the rib of Adam. So she was treated as a secondary one. Because first was Adam, and then from Adam's rib was created. And some church fathers were using this narrative to promote that women should be silent, they are secondary, they cannot speak, and so on. So when we come to the Armenian text, we find that the Armenian author of Agathangelos, we don't know who Agathangelos was, but he adopts this second view that I mentioned by Irenaeus. So basically he says, yes, through Eve, the first virgin, death entered the world. So through this virgin, life will enter the world. This virgin is a reference to the Virgin Mary, so I just took it out of context, but this is a reference to the Virgin Mary. Through the Virgin Mary, we have the reverse process. So we cannot blame everything on women because of Eve, because the Virgin Mary was also a woman. Another interesting bit is that the early Greek and Syriac and Latin church fathers would always blame Eve for what happened. The Armenian church, at least in this text, adopts a different approach. This is something that we also find in some Syriac texts as well. So it could be Syriac influence. But they kind of adopted this view that it's not just Eve. Adam had freedom and free will and wisdom from God. So if Eve committed this sin, why did he follow? He is equally to blame. And so the blame was put both on Adam and Eve, not just on Eve. And this is my favorite part from that text. And I took this first part of this statement and used it as the title of a book. So, women too were blessed on account of the virgin birth, which was from among them. That is, the Virgin Mary, again, going back to this idea. Through the Virgin Mary, everyone was saved, including women. So we cannot put the blame on women anymore. So this is a received tradition of the Armenian Church. This is something that no one speaks about, unfortunately, and I realize that I need to do that. There are other descriptions by Saint Gregory himself. So I want you to understand that part of this text, Saint Gregory speaks to the people. He's teaching the Armenian religion there. And he uses specific words to describe these women. And these women are described as a strong fortress and mighty tower, reference to Hripsime and her companions. Protectors by intercession, so they can intercede between you, that is Armenian people, and God. And another very important thing, they were valiant in the shedding of blood, so that by their martyrdom they might bring you to God. So Saint Gregory himself says that you became Christian only because these women shed their blood on the Armenians. Through their act of martyrdom, through their confession of faith, you were brought close to God and you became Christian. So this is one of the major messages that we find in Agathangel's history. So this is in the text. Now, another interesting thing that a colleague of mine from Geneva University, Valentina Calzolari, wrote an article about this. She pointed out very shortly the following thing, that the first Armenian churches were built in the places where these virgins, Hripsime and their companions, were killed, were martyred. So not only, and they were buried there, so not only symbolically, like by shedding their blood, they brought Armenians close to Christianity, but also physically, they laid the foundation of the Armenian church. They are in the foundation of Armenian church. So you could see, so this is St. Hripsime Church in Echmiadzin. This is Saint Shohagat, and this is Saint Gane. So the churches that you see here were built later. However, we know that in those places there were shrines. So for example, if you go to St. Hripsime, underneath the church there is the tomb of Saint Hripsime. So also they are physically in the foundation of first Armenian churches, not just symbolically. Now, this is the image that, in my mind, summarizes the story of Agathangelos. We could see Hripsime here, holding her cross and standing on King Tartat. So the cross symbolizes, of course, her Christianity, the Christianity that she brought with her from Rome. And the king is under her feet because he's pagan. At this stage, he's still a pagan. So symbolically, Hripsime's Christianity defeated the paganism of King Tartat. And this is actually a painting. It's not a mosaic. It looks like a mosaic. This is a painting in the Armenian church in Yalta, in Crimea. This was done, it was renovated, and this is, I think, a 21st century depiction of it. So I used this as a cover for my book when I published this on the topic, because I think that summarizes pretty well the stance of the Armenian church, at least in the 5th century. So I hope now you have a better understanding of that story of Saint Gregory. And I will try to now draw some connection with today. Many of you are familiar with this image. You can find this also on the Armenian Studies Program's website, Fresno's website. This is connected to the person who actually made this bar-relief. So it's by Yervand Gojabashian, who had an exhibition last year here. And when I came to Fresno for an interview, it actually coincided, so I was able to attend that particular exhibition, which was a fantastic exhibition. So this is in Echmiadzin. This was, I think, in 2002 or 4 revealed. So this is called the Gate of Saint Gregory. And I just want you to look at the imagery. So you could see the king on the left, and you could see Saint Gregory on the right. And no reference to Hripsime and her companions. This could be just a vision of a sculptor, and it could be something that how he envisioned this thing. But if you put it into a wider context, you realize that this is the narrative that you constantly see in textbooks. This is what you constantly see from most priests teaching or preaching during the sermons in the church. And I actually found this also in the Armenian school, in the Sunday Armenian school in London. My son was going to that school, so he came home one day and said, we learned today about Christianization. And I said, okay, tell me what you learned. And of course it was, well, Taftat and then St. Gregory, and this is one. And I said, and did you learn anything about Ripsimeter companions? No, we were told that it was St. Gregory who converted King Taftat and so on. It was the abridged version, so he showed me this. So this is part of our education system as well. So what I did, I wanted to figure out, is this actually also the same thing in Armenia? So I managed to find these two books online. So the first one is the 7th grade History of Armenia textbook. This is the text that teaches Christianization in Armenia. And the second one is the History of the Armenian Church. That was a subject, I think it's not anymore, but this was also a textbook used in the schools in the Republic of Armenia. And I will just show you one passage from that text. So I took this from chapter on Christianization. So I will translate this for you. So I've highlighted this, and the translation goes like this. So the story that you just heard is presented in that textbook like this. By the order of Taftat III, Gregory Bartet spent 10 years in the prison of Horvirat. At the end of the 3rd century, Christians, Ripsimians in brackets it put, fled to Armenia. By the decision of Taftat III, they were executed. Coming out of Horvirat, Gregory begins to preach Christianity in Armenia. It's like, it doesn't even make sense to read it like as a, I don't know, as a coherent text. I mean, if my students write something like this, they will get a very low grade for this. I mean, there is no logic what they have put. So why did they come in the 3rd century? Why they were martyred? Why did the king kill them? So nothing. And then when you read the rest, again, nothing Ripsime. Then it just says that St. Gregory built the churches where the Ripsime companions were killed, and nothing else. So this same thing is repeated in all the history textbooks as well. I want to take you back to the 5th century. So these were two texts. The first one about the Syriac tradition that came from into Armenian, about Sanducht, prominent role that she played. Agathangel speaks about the prominent role of Ripsime and her companions. But we have, these are stories. These are stories written by men. These are stories, these are history that men wrote and tried with the idea of trying to promote Christianity. But in those stories, we find these references to women, and we see what prominent role we played there. But it wasn't only that. So we have a church council that happens in 444. And at the time, what we know about this council is that the Armenian Mekhitarist, the Magna, and lay people, and everyone else, the church leaders, they all come together. And they come up with 20 canons, 20 rules everyone in the Armenian society has to follow. And when you read 20 rules, you will be surprised to find out that in the 5th century, for the Armenians, there was no difference between men and women. The punishment was for the crime, not for the gender of the person. I'm saying this because exactly at the same time, in the Greek tradition, the Greek women were punished 10 times more severely than men for the same crime. So for example, in the Greek tradition, if a girl ran away with a boy because they wanted to marry, the parents disagreed, and they were caught afterwards, there was a death sentence for the girl, and some sort of punishment, like a fine and something else for the guy, for the boy. So women punished much more severely, and that was something that we find in the 4th, 5th centuries. In the Armenian tradition, they come up with these canons, and I will just mention only 3 canons. So this is canon number 2. If the daughter of a priest is found in fornication, let her have no share in the church, and let her be removed from the priest's house. Let a severe penance and penalty be imposed on her, and the same penalty will apply to the son of the priest. So no distinction. This is one canon. Canon number 10. Regarding those who do charms but do not practice sorcery. If men or women are found doing charms, let them be flogged 15 times, breaded, covered in ashes, and have their bones crushed. Very severe, of course, but at least from our perspective, from the perspective of today's talk, men and women are punished equally in the same way. So again, gender does not play any role in this. And there is in the same canon, there is this reference to 1 Corinthians where this quite famous quote from the Bible, the husband does not rule over his body, but the wife does. Likewise, the wife does not rule over her body, but the husband. This is one passage in the Bible that we focus on this and try to promote equal rights in the church. We can build lots of things on this. But unfortunately, there are other passages which are, let's say, more convenient for men. And this is why they are using those passages. And I will show you those ones as well. So this is one that I mentioned earlier. St. Paul. Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law always says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. It is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Of course, I've taken this out of context, but this is taken out of context by the representatives of the church themselves. They use this out of context and try to impose the fact that women cannot do anything in the church. They are not allowed to do certain things. Another passage, again, very largely quoted. And again, try to keep in mind, because I'll bring you, this is in the Bible. We'll come to the 21st century, you will see that this is still there. So, let a woman learn in silence full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. So these two quotes are still used by the church leaders to silence women and not to give them rights in the church. I want to point you at something that the Armenian church has quite unique. So this comes from a medieval period. And this is a book that I helped to translate. So this is the updated version of Abel Manukyan's Deaconesses in the Armenian Church. He first published this in 1984. And then he reached out to me and asked me to translate it from, he published it first in Eastern and Western Armenian, and he wanted the English translation. So this book has just come out in August. And this is a story of deaconesses in the Armenian tradition. So the Armenian church has this right of how to ordain a deaconess, a woman, into that office. And there are no restrictions. And this is written in the Armenian ritual book, the ritual book that the church uses until today. It was put down in writing in the 9th century approximately. So this is kind of a history of how in the 9th century we already have this, and throughout that period we had in different parts of Armenia or Armenian communities around the world, we had deaconesses. We had them in Poland, we have had them in Ukraine, in Iran. In modern times we had them in Argentina, and a very recent development, relatively recent, 2019, this is in Tehran. Another deaconess was ordained in the church, Ani Christi Mandan. So, and the bishop there justified, he said, well, tradition, why not? We can have women deaconesses serving in the church, because we need to involve everyone, especially in the 21st century. However, the church is very reluctant in many places to allow women to do this. And I should say this is a quite unique tradition. If we think about all the traditional churches, like Syriac, Catholic, Orthodox churches, none of them has some of this that we have in the Armenian church. And we can cherish this and promote, but unfortunately it's not done yet fully. So that book, the publication of that book that came out recently, hopefully would help some, at least to give a historical perspective on this. And remember I told you, keep in mind those quotes from the Bible where women be silent. So there was this research done in Armenia in 2014, and it was funded by USAID and some other organization. So this was about how the role of women is perceived in the religious communities in Armenia, both the Armenian Apostolic Church and any other smaller churches that we have there. And what do we find, what the findings say? So, to substantiate their view that women cannot play any important role in the church, the Armenian Apostolic Church quotes the following passages from New Testament. the ones that I read for you. That women are not allowed to speak, that's what St. Paul said. So 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 1 Timothy 2:11 and 12. I did further digging. I went to this website of the diocese of the Armenian diocese, one of the largest dioceses in Armenia. And they have, this is a very useful website. It has a lot of information for people. There are books as well you can download and lots of interesting stuff there. And I wanted to see what this website says about the role of women. This is the article entitled Kina Yevyekevetsin, the woman and the church. So it is written in a form of question and answer. So I have translated just one bit of it. So the question is, wouldn't it be right if the church also emphasized and confirmed the equality between men and women? The answer, one of the prominent clerics of the Russian Orthodox Church, the priest Alexander Shneman, who is famous for his theological and ecclesiastical works, says that comparison, which lies at the base of equality, is a source of evil. It leads to a rebellion and division. It is the origin of Satan. Equality is established, uselessness of distinctions. To the demonic principle of comparison, Christianity opposes love, the essence of which lies in the absence of equality. There is not and there cannot be equality in this world because the world was created by love and not by principles. It is ridiculous, right? But this is, I checked it today, it's still on the website. This is from 2017. And this is, as I said, one of the most important websites in Armenia until today. A question comes to my mind, why is the priest who's asking these questions, his name is below, I'm not going to name him, but if you go to this website you'll find it. Why is he referring to a representative of a Russian Orthodox Church, which is not in communion with the Armenian Apostolic Church? That's one question. The other question is, why not refer to the Armenian sources? If we like so much our tradition, why not to go back to, let's say, the Agathangelos? This is history where we see St. Gregory speaking about women. Why not to use that? And I think this is the key question today, is what kind of choices the church leaders make. So throughout our history, we had church leaders who were very proactive in engaging women, trying to support the communities in various ways, and women were always part of that. There are other leaders who made different choices, excluding women from most of the things that they could contribute. This is something that came across in 2019. It was a tweet from His Holiness Catholicos Aram I of Cilicia, where on the 8th of March speaks about the equality between men and women is one of the fundamental principles of Christianity. So, again, there is some sort of disagreement between what the priest there says and what the Catholicos says here, right? So he speaks about equality as a fundamental principle of Christianity. And just to conclude, I think it all comes to the choices that we make. What kind of choice the leadership would make, what kind of narrative they will promote. So my work attempted to try and build this narrative that we have another story, we have a real story, the original story that we could bring to the surface and use that one as our truth, especially since it comes from St. Gregory's teaching himself. So I mean, you can consider St. Gregory as one of the most important saints in our tradition. Why not to listen to what he's saying, right? So I'm with my favorite wizard of all times, that it's our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are. It's our choices that will change a little bit, at least, the perception and the role of women in this society. Thank you very much for your attention, and please ask me any questions you want.